welcome to the DDI What's New 2013 CADcast series. My topic for today is Workgroup and Enterprise PDM. Now I'd like to jump right into it, so let's get into it. The first thing I'm going to cover is Workgroup PDM. And there are two new enhancements I'd like to get into in Workgroup PDM. The first one being an enhancement to the export tool. The export tool now supports allowing the user to export only files with the current revision scheme. That's the new enhancement for the export tool. And there's also a new enhancement to the Vault Admin tool. We now have a Vault Management tab in the Vault Admin tool. So, without further ado, what I'd like to do is just go ahead and jump right into it. So, as I mentioned, one of the first enhancements I like to get into is in the export tool. And if you haven't used the export tool, it's certainly not new. It's intended for those that want to take information and put it outside of the Vault. Maybe I'm migrating to another PDM system and I need to get information out of my current Workgroup PDM Vault. That's where I'd use the export tool. And again, if you haven't used it, it's in the install directory for Workgroup PDM. So if I go to my C drive, under Program Files x86, you'll find a folder called SOLIDWORKS Corp, SOLIDWORKS Workgroup PDM, and then lastly a folder called Vault. Now in this Vault folder you'll find the PDMW export tool, and again it's not new, it's been around for a long time. What I'd like to point out is an option with it. So if I go ahead and log in, you'll see my different projects I can export. The new thing I want to point out is this option right here in the bottom. And what this option does is it allows me to export only the current revision scheme. And I want to explain that because it sounds very similar to the option just above it. I export only the latest revisions. Export the files with the current revision scheme means that, let's say hypothetically that when I started Workgroup PDM, I started with a revision scheme of 1, 2, 3, 4. And a year or so into it, we decide, okay, we're going to change over to A, B, C, D as our revision scheme method. What this tool will do, or this option will do, is allow me to find the files with only that current revision scheme, ignoring all those with older revision schemes, and export only those files. So it's a relatively simple option. It's just a simple checkbox that I run when I export. But again, it looks back to find only the files with the current revision scheme. So all I really have to do is hit go. It of course exports, and that's pretty much the tool. But again, what I wanted to point out is that new option to export only the current revision scheme. So my next enhancement to Workgroup PDM is in the Vault Admin. So what I'd like to do is call up the Vault Admin, and we'll log in here. What I want to point out is this new Vault Management tab. Now the Vault Management tab is just a tab. They brought similar management tools together in a common location in the Vault Admin. And some of these are relocated from other places. Some of them are actually new to the Vault Admin, like this one here for services. You can now start and stop the service right from the Vault Management tab. And this simplifies it from previous versions because, of course, you had to go into Windows, right? I had to go into Management Device Manager to Services and actually stop the Workgroup PDM service. So I'll show you what I mean here. I used to have to go to Manage, Device Manager, right? Call up my services, find the Workgroup PDM server service, and of course, right-click and stop. So that's what I had to do in previous versions of the software, and it was always kind of a clunky way. You had to know how to do it. Now you can just go through the Vault Admin, and on that Vault Management tab, you'll now have the option to stop the service. Okay, so same option you had here in the services. If you come back to the Vault Management tab, you have it right there, stop, as well. Now, like I mentioned before, some of the other stuff that's on this Vault Management tab, like this Vault Information, for instance, is really just relocated. It used to be formerly on the Vault Settings tab. You have the similar options there. So it gives you the same things, but they just relocated every management tool to its own tab in the Vault Admin. So the validation, the rebuilding of the Vault, things like that. Again, they were really just relocated from other places in the Vault Admin tool. So these are a few of the enhancements. The new Vault Management tab in the Vault Admin, and again, some of these tools are really just relocated from other places in the Vault Admin tool, but those are the new enhancements for 2013 in the Vault Admin in Workgroup PDM. So what I'd like to do is jump right into Enterprise PDM and cover some of the new enhancements for the 2013 release of Enterprise PDM, and there are a lot of enhancements. There are a few more than listed on this slide that I'm going to cover as we go through this, but there are a number of different enhancements to EPDM for the 2013 release. So we got a lot to cover. I want to jump right into it. Let's go ahead and call up the administration tool for Enterprise PDM. And one of the first things I'd like to get into if we get into the administration tool is this new recently used list that you get as soon as you launch the EPDM administration tool. So as soon as you launch the tool, you're going to get this list of the commands you've done last, right? The most recently used commands in the EPDM administration tool. So it's a quick way to get back to something if I'm trying something out, if I'm changing something. I can also clear it here in the bottom right corner. So if I want to clear this list out and then start building a new list, I can do it with the clear command. But again, the sole function of this command is just to show you what you've done last and make it a quick, easy way to get back to that command. So that's the recently used list. You're going to get it as soon as you start up the administration tool for Enterprise PDM. So the next thing I'd like to get into are some enhancements to the workflow editor. So let's go ahead and call up a workflow, and you'll notice the interface for a workflow is different in this release. They've tried to simplify it and give the user a little bit more visual feedback about what's going on in the different states and transitions. Another nice thing that you can now do is you can now zoom in and out of a workflow. So if you have a really complicated workflow that takes up a lot of space, you can now zoom in and out of it. And I can zoom using the scroll wheel, or I can zoom using the commands in the top left corner there. The same command, similar commands to what you'd see in SOLIDWORKS Zoom. So you can now zoom in and out of a workflow. Another thing I want to point out are some of the enhancements to the property managers for these states and transitions. You'll notice not only here in the feedback in the actual workflow, you'll see, for instance, if a transition has a notification, you'll get a little icon showing notification. But you don't see everything until you actually go into one of the states or transitions. So the feedback, it's really just showing you here in the interface what's active for that transition. For instance, that transition had a notification. The under editing state is the initial state, so you see the icon for it. So it's only showing me what I have active for that, what is attached to that particular state of transition. So the next thing I'd like to get into is the delayed in-state notifications. And the whole idea behind this is it allows me to notify a user if a file's been in a particular state for too long. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and call up, and one of the other things I want to point out before I get into this is just the enhancements to the property manager for each one of these states or transitions. So if I click on this, notice the interface change. You no longer have separate commands and dialogues for notifications and permissions. Everything's now in one place. So here's my notifications, I have my permissions all in one spot. Now the delayed in-state notifications require folder notifications. So here I'm going to build a folder notification, right, just for the whole Homatra folder here. And what I want to point out is this new type of notification. So under type, you're going to see an option for delayed in-state. And the way this works is you specify a period of time, right? So I specify delayed in-state notification. And basically what it says is in this workflow, in this approved state, I want to trigger the user if a file's been in this state for after 1 day. So after 24 hours of it being in the approved state, it will now trigger a notification, right? And I can also trigger another notification. There's also a resend option. So I can say, okay, after the first initial 1 day, resend every other day. So every 2 days now it's going to send another notification. So if a file sits in a particular state for a long time, the user will continue to get notifications prompting them to maybe review the file, whatever the notification is intended for. But again, you have to set up the amount of time you want it to notify you with, right? So initially it's going to notify the user after a day being in that state, and then resend it every 2 days. Now, of course, I need to add the recipient, so I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to notify all engineers. Okay. So now every engineer, after a day of this being in this state will get notified, and then it'll be resent every 2 days. So that's really how I build a delayed in state notification. Now, one thing I want to point out is you cannot type in like 0.5 or 0.25. You're going to get an unacceptable character error. It will not accept anything less than whole numbers. So you can't notify someone every half day, for instance. It has to be whole days. So that is the enhancement. That's the delayed in-state notification. It's really just intended to add additional notifications if a file's sat in a particular state for too long. Okay? So those are some of the enhancements to delayed in-state notifications, to notifications in general. Now I can do it at the folder level like that, but I can also do this in Windows Explorer. So let me log into a local view here. And what I want to point out is if I do a notify, right? If I right-click any file and I say notify me when, right? Say notify me when, you'll now see an option for a delayed in-state type of notification. And this is a per file notification, okay, which of course isn't new, but I'm really just saying here for this file, if it sits in the approved state for more than a day, notify me. Okay? So again, that's the whole idea behind delayed in state, and you can really do it in the workflow with a folder notification, or you can do it at the file level with a file notification in the right-click menu. But again, delayed in state notification really just intended to prompt the user if a file sat in a particular state for too long. So that's the new delayed in state notification. What I'd like to get into next is a new form of transition referred to as a parallel transition. And the whole idea behind it is it allows me to specify multiple users that have to approve a file before it's allowed to move from one state to the next. And it's a type of transition. So if I wanted 2 or more people to approve a file before it's allowed to move on to the next state, I could use a parallel transition. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to create a multiple stage approval process going from waiting for approval to approved. What I'm going to do is go ahead and delete this standard transition. I'm going to create a new transition from waiting for approval to approved, and we'll go ahead and call it MultiStage Approval. And the big difference here is under type. You're going to notice a new type of transition referred to as parallel. And the way this works is it's all based on a series of roles. So I add roles to establish who the required users that have to approve this file are. Right? So I can go ahead and create a role, and we'll go ahead and call this first role managers. I'm going to hit add member, and we'll add the managers, both Ian and Neil. Now what I want to point out about this is one of 2, meaning either Ian or Neil can approve this design. Either or. Now if I wanted both of them to be required, I could select 2. But right now I'm fine with either Ian or Neil approving this design. Okay, so the required users is just that, who's required to approve it. So now you'll see I have the manager's role added and one of 2 users. I'm going to go ahead and add another role. We'll call it engineers. And I'm going to add the engineers group. And basically what I'm saying is either, again, just like before, either of these engineers can approve the design. Okay? So one required user, either Jeremy or Mark, are allowed to approve this design. Okay, so once I have that, I'll hit OK, and now I have both roles established. So one engineer and one manager has to approve the design before it's allowed to move on to the next state. Now, like with all transitions, I of course have to establish permissions. So I go to my permissions, I make sure that I have given everybody the appropriate privileges. Let's give myself access to it too. Okay. So make sure that everybody has the right permissions. And now I've created a parallel transition. Okay. One thing I want to point out about these parallel transitions, the first thing you'll notice is they show up as green. Okay, so again, that's a bit of that interface change for 2013, giving you a little bit more visual feedback. Parallel transitions will be green. They also have 2 arrows. Okay. Also notice the color of the other transitions. Normal transitions will show up in that standard gray color, just like this or this. And if I were to modify it, you don't have to go through this. Let's go down to the bottom here and modify this transition. If I were to modify this and make it an automatic transition, that has its own color as well. It'll show up as red. Okay, and again, you get the little lightning bolt icon showing you it's an automatic transition, just a little bit of that user interface enhancement for 2013. So it's just giving you that color-coded feedback about what type of transition it is. So I've got this set up. What I'd like to do is show you how it works. So let's go ahead and save it. And I'm going to jump into Windows Explorer and we'll walk a file through here and prove this out. So I'm first going to log on as Ian. And you'll see I have this ARM file sitting in the waiting for approval state. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and right click. We'll do a change state and you'll see the multi-stage approval. Also notice the 0 of 2. Okay. You'll see 0 of 2, meaning 0 of the 2 necessary people, 2 required users in order to move it on, have approved this design. So I go ahead and call it up. I say, okay, it looks good. What you'll notice is that little result, it says requires 1 more user. Normally that's just a checkbox says okay, but this requires 1 more user before it's allowed to move on. Okay. So what this means is once I hit OK, it is not going to move on to the next state. So if I hit OK, the first thing you'll notice is it still says waiting for approval. So it has not passed on to the next state. Again, because this is a multi-stage approval, this is a parallel transition, it requires more than 1 user to pass it on to the next state. The other thing I want to point out is you can revoke the approval. So if you do not, or you made the mistake and did not want to approve that design, you can come back after you've approved it and say revoke that approval. And that'll go back to 0 of 2 required users to pass it on to the next state. Okay, so there is a way to undo, so to speak, an approval of a design. So now I've got 1 of 2 required users. What I'd like to do next is log in as a different user and then pass this through to the next state. So let's go ahead and log off as Ian. And I'm going to log back in as Mark. I'm going to right click the ARM, go to change state. You'll see multi-stage approval now says 1 of 2. Okay, so now I have 1 of the required 2 users that have approved this design. And if I call that up, I again can leave a comment. Okay, good to go. Notice result says okay. So no longer is there a required user. I'm the last required user. Also notice you have the history, right? So I can see the notes of the other approved or the other required users that had to approve this design. I can see their history. I can see their notes. So I go ahead and hit OK, and now it has passed on to the approved state. Okay? So that is the parallel transition. Again, the whole idea is it requires 2 or more users to approve something before it's allowed to move on to the next state. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So what I'd like to get into next is a new feature for Enterprise PDM 2013, and it's referred to as version-free variables. And basically the way it works is it allows me to edit variables of a file without creating another version, without checking it out, without creating a new version of the file. I can change properties of that file, right? Variables of that file. So if it's small properties of the file that you want to change, but you don't necessarily need to create a whole nother version for, this is where you'd use version-free variables. And it's relatively simple to set up. I just want to take a moment to kind of set up a hypothetical. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to be able to alter the cost of a file, right? Cost is a variable that's often associated with files. Let's say I want to be able to edit the cost of a file without creating a new version. And that's a situation in which I might use version-free variables. So let's go to this handrail. And you'll see here I have a variable called cost, and I have a value for cost there. And this is a perfect situation where I want to be able to edit that variable without creating another version of the file, without checking out that file. And what's nice about the version-free variables is you can actually modify the variables in a file you don't even have access to check out, right? So if it's in a state where I don't have access to check it out, I can still modify the version-free variables, okay, assuming I have the correct permissions. And that's what I'd like to go over next. This takes a moment to set up in terms of in the administration tool. And the first thing I have to do is I actually have to edit the variable I want to make version free. So I'm going to go to cost here, and one of the new options you'll see is this checkbox that says version free. So any variable that you want to edit version free without modifying version, you have to check version free on that variable. Okay, so I have to modify the variable. The other thing I want to point out is, do you want to allow the users to update all versions of this file or just the latest? Okay, that is a separate permission, a separate option when you're setting up a version-free variable. Okay, so again, I have to go in and specify, do I want to allow all versions or latest? Do I need to, you also need to specify it is in fact a version-free variable, right? That's the first step, version-free. Once you do this, you also have to allow the user access to that version-free variable, and you do that in the states themselves. So if I go into a state properties here, you'll see a new option, edit version-free variable data. So you have to allow the users access to do this, right? So if I go through these, you see I've given permission to edit version-free variable data. Let's go to the next state here. You'll see, again, you have to allow the user to do this. Okay, this is a new option, so you may want to check it if you're going from 2013 or 2012 to 2013. Make sure you have this on if you intend to use it. But those are really the two steps necessary to use this version-free variable option. Now the way this works is clearly I don't have the file checked out, right? So if I highlight this handrail, it's not checked out, right? Version 1 of 1. And what this allows me to do is edit the data card, right? So I come in here and I change the data card. Let's change the cost. Okay. And now, if you click anywhere outside the data card, you're going to get prompted. You have modified the contents in this card. Do you want to save changes? I say yes. Now I can also hit the save icon in the top right corner, and essentially does the same thing, but now it's written that cost to the data card. Okay? Notice still version 1 of 1. So I modified the cost, but I did not create a new version of the file. And that's the whole idea behind version-free variables. Okay? It allows me to modify variables of the file without checking it out, without modifying and creating a whole nother version. Now some caveats to this that I think are worth pointing out. If you have a file checked out, it's going to create a new version. Okay? So if I check out a file and then modify a variable and check it back in, it's going to create a new version. That's standard behavior. It behaved that way in previous versions as well. But this is really intended for those that do not check out the file. They just want to modify a variable without checking it out, without creating a new version. So if you check out a file, you will create a new version, even if only thing you're modifying is the variable. Also, if your workflow modifies a variable, it will create a new version as well. There's some ways we could do it with dispatch where it doesn't, but by default, if your workflow modifies the variable, it's going to create a new version. Okay, that's the way it works as of 2013. So that's the new enhancement. That's version-free variables, brand new for Enterprise PDM in the 2013 release. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on. So the next thing I'd like to get into are some of the enhancements to File Explorer for Enterprise PDM in 2013 release. And one of the first things you'll notice when browsing to files in Windows Explorer for Enterprise PDM is you'll get this user information pop-up as you mouse over anybody's name. So here I've moused over Mark, and you'll see all the details for Mark pop up in this user information pop-up dialog. So I get username, I get how many files they've checked out, what their phone number is, a little avatar showing me a picture. I also have options to send mail. I have a link address so I can link to my website. Also, if you use Microsoft Office Communicator or Office Link, you'll see other options here for things like calling a user, VoIP calls, sending chat messages. So you'll see other options if you use Microsoft Office Communicator or Office Link. You'll see other commands there as well. I also have this presence note, which gives me kind of a status of that particular user. So it allows me to establish a status and then everybody else can see it. I can pin this menu down, and of course I have a close option here. But this user information pop-up just gives me a breakdown of the details for that user. Okay, especially helpful in an environment where I have multiple different locations and everybody may not be familiar with each user. Now this is set up in the user settings. So if I go into the user settings, you'll see the very first general properties lists all this information. So I have the image there on the left. I have all the details about that user on the right. Right, so email address, website, phone number, even that presence note is a property of the user right there under general properties when you're first establishing your user. So all the information it's pulling from for that user information pop-up is coming from right here. So that's the new user information pop-up in File Explorer. The next thing I'd like to point out are some enhancements to the general user interface for File Explorer, and in particular the Bill of Materials. If I call up the Bill of Materials tab, you'll see the interface has kind of been overhauled for viewing Bill of Materials, and what they did is try and segregate different commands to simplify it for the end user. Right? So I have a series of commands, and really the common commands are grouped together. So I have all my view tools on the left here. Right? Then I go to the next one, I have all my options for how I view the Bill of Materials here. Which file version I'd like to view, right, version 2, or which configuration I'd like to view. And on the right-hand side, I have all the different commands I'd like to do to the bill of materials. So I have save, open CSV, search, compare, all those functions, all the commands you'd like to do to a bill of materials are on the right-hand side. And again, the idea is a ribbon-style interface where I group all the common commands together. Now, another new enhancement is to the compare function. Compare no longer launches a separate dialog. You actually see the interface change. So when I hit compare, you'll see the interface shift, and it tells me you're comparing version 2 to version 1. So no longer is a separate dialog that pops up. Everything just changes in the bill of materials interface for the compare function. Okay, so version of version, configuration to configuration. I can do the compare without, again, launching a different dialog. And of course, it works the same way as it did before. It just highlights the component or the things that have changed since, or between the two versions or configurations. Typical compare functionality. One thing to note is you do have to hit close comparison on the right-hand side before you can get back to your standard bill of materials. Okay, so that's one caveat. You need to go back to close comparison in order to get back to your standard bill of materials tab. Now, this ribbon style interface carries over to the contains and where used as well. So the contains and where used interface has been overhauled to simplify it. The idea is, again, you put common things next to one another. So I have options here, right? I have commands, I have versions on the left-hand side. So I have my file options on the left-hand side. I have my options there, and then I have my commands on the right-hand side. So I can do things like save, open CSV, so on. Okay. So again, this spills over to not just bill of materials where used, but you also get this same level of functionality, the same similar interface in the contains tab. Right? So if I go to the contains tab, it has the same thing. I have my source information, I have my options, and of course I have my commands. And if I highlight a part, I can open in SolidWorks. Right, I can view the properties, and I can browse to or launch that folder location for that file. So it's just simplified interface. It's very ribbon-like in terms of, they've grouped common commands together. But those are some of the enhancements to the File Explorer interface for 2013. The next thing I'd like to go over is notice the local view under my favorites. By default, any local view you create in 2013 will automatically get added to your favorites in Windows Explorer. And this is just to simplify getting back and forth to that local view, it'll now automatically add it to your favorites list. Okay. Now the next thing I want to go over is an enhancement to the paste as reference command. Now I could always right click a file and paste as a reference, right? So if I right click this Word doc, I say copy, and I right click the assembly file, I could say paste as reference. But what's new and what I want to point out about this is now you can add a different quantity, right? So I can specify how many of these instruction manuals I'd like attached as a reference to the assembly. So I can say 3. Okay? And what this will mean is, of course, it'll show up in the bill of materials as quantity 3 when I check in the file, right? So the whole idea is that you're allowed to specify a number of references. So if I go ahead and check this in, you'll notice now there are 3 Word docs attached as a reference, okay, quantity 3. So the paste as reference got an enhancement. I can now paste multiple references by specifying quantity. So one of the last things I want to go over are the new enhancements to the EPDM add-in inside of SOLIDWORKS. So let's go ahead and check out an assembly, and I'll go ahead and open it up. And as I mentioned, I just want to point out a few of the new things for the EPDM add-in inside of SOLIDWORKS. So one of the first things you'll notice is the user information pop-up that I got in File Explorer. I also get that same pop-up in the EPDM tab in the task pane. So if I mouse over a name, there's the user information pop-up. The next thing I want to point out is this flyout menu. This flyout menu is meant to handle tools as the menu collapses. So as I collapse the task pane, it will absorb all those tools that no longer fit in the menu, right? So if I expand that out, there's all those tools. And if I drag the task pane back out, the tools automatically come back to the toolbar. So that flyout menu is just meant to handle resizing the task pane, so you always get the same set of tools. The next thing I want to point out is an enhancement to the check-in function. The check-in function, if I go ahead and hit check-in, now supports closing files upon check-in, right? So close files after check-in, and just like the name implies, if I hit check-in, it will check in the file, then close it out of SOLIDWORKS. This saves me the step of having to do that separately. So those are the new features for Enterprise PDM in 2013. Feel free to visit us at www.bdicad.com.